Welcome to the final lesson of the muscle gain module, where we'll be talking about optimal distribution of protein through the day, as well as the Peri exercise time frame for the goal of maximizing muscle growth. So let's get into it. So when we talk about protein distribution, protein timing, let's remember that this is the icing on the cake. The cake is total daily protein, and the timing of the constituent doses is a thin layer of icing on the cake at best. So, now when we're talking about the anabolic window, and we'll graduate into talking about the peri-exercise time frame, let's first begin with the time course of amino acid availability in the blood as a result of ingesting a bolus of protein. So, as shown in these graphs, and this was a nice study by Power and colleagues from back in 2009. They're looking at a 40-gram dose of protein, of whey protein. And even with the substantial dose of protein, it was a quickly absorbed protein, which whey is. The point at which amino acid levels peaked in the blood, so in other words, the point at which nutrient availability was maximal, was about 45 to 60 minutes after ingestion. And so, even with a quickly digested and absorbed protein source, without other macronutrients in the way of flattening out the curve of the absorption profile, even without that, just the quickly absorbed protein by itself, availability of amino acids in the blood was maximal at about 45 to 60 minutes after ingestion. So, this point becomes important when you consider that it doesn't really make sense for there to be an anabolic window post exercise for you to actually ingest protein or nutrients for that matter. If indeed the game is about maximizing availability at a particular point, like post exercise, if that indeed was the case, then you would have to account for the fact that it takes about 45 to 60 minutes for amino acids in circulation to be at maximal levels after you ingest a bolus of protein. So, this is a big point that I think is important for debunking the post exercise anabolic window. So, given that, we have something called the Peri exercise time frame. So, the Peri exercise time frame is the point or the time frame between the pre exercise protein feeding and the post exercise protein feeding, or you can just think of it as the time frame between the pre exercise meal and the post exercise meal. And so, Brad Schoenfeld and I, we hypothesized that if you want to maximize the anabolic effect or the anabolic interaction of nutrient availability and resistance training, then you would want to make sure that the peri-exercise period is not stretched much beyond 5 hours. In other words, you wouldn't want there to be much more big of a time stretch than 5 hours between the pre-exercise meal and the post-exercise meal. This is because the pre and post-exercise meal would provide a maximal priming of the anabolic environment for the training bout in terms of both fueling and recovery. And so I know that was a mouthful, but yes, so the peri-exercise period or the peri-exercise time frame, we proposed that it should be somewhere between 3 to 5-ish hours, possibly 6. For purposes of simplicity and because it's illustrated there, let's just say 3 to 5 hour peri-exercise window would be optimal for maximizing muscle growth. But first, mind the hierarchy. So, of first importance is total daily protein intake. You will achieve the vast lion's share of your goals for muscle growth if you just simply focus on nailing the total daily protein intake. And so, given that, optimal total daily protein intake, that golden range, is somewhere between 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. And as I discussed in a previous lesson, if you want to kind of get a little more specific with it, it would be on the basis of target body weight or goal body weight. Because some people in a state of obesity could potentially be over-prescribing themselves a protein intake if you base it on current body weight for individuals with obesity. So, given this total daily protein range of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, and given that when you look at the span of the literature, and this is something that Brad and I investigated in this particular paper, which you're seeing on the screen there, we found that you can maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis from a protein dose that was somewhere between 0.4 to 0.55 grams per kilogram of body weight. So in imperial terms, that translates to about 0.2 to 0.25 grams per pound. And in absolute bottom line-ish terms, that translates to somewhere between 30-ish to 50-ish grams of protein. So it's this per meal dose that maximizes the anabolic response. In other words, maximizes muscle protein synthesis. And so, given that the protein dose that maximizes muscle protein synthesis is somewhere between 0.4 to 0.55 grams per kilogram of body weight, the number of those doses you needed per day to achieve a total of 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight was 4 doses. So it was just a simple bit of arithmetic there. So we start at the top. How much total daily protein do you need to maximize muscle growth? 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is 0.7 to 1.0 grams per pound. Okay, so we have that at the top of the hierarchy. You achieve that, then you're basically set. Now, if you want to go for the icing on the cake, then you make that total be comprised of doses that maximize muscle protein synthesis. And it appears that you can maximize muscle protein synthesis with 4 doses consisting of 0.4 to about 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. Okay, so that is what we know today. That is the state of the evidence on protein distribution for maximizing muscle growth. So those 4 doses over the course of the day would probably be best positioned spread out versus skewed or squunched together in a narrow window. So other icing on the cake, probably best for a completely different lecture. But creatine, as we know, as far as the goal of muscle size and strength goes, it's probably the single most prolifically studied supplement for this purpose. And everything else is just somewhat trivial in comparison to creatine as a legal ergogenic supplement for the primary goal of building muscle size and strength. Now, more icing on the cake is the question of intra-workout nutrition. And so for individuals who are either forced to resistance train right after they get up and they don't have time for a pre-exercise meal, then you can justify intra-workout nutrition. Another scenario where you can justify intra-workout nutrition is if your training bout lasts I would say significantly longer than an hour. And certainly if it lasted up to 90 minutes and beyond, certainly approaching 2 hours, but that's very rare. If your resistance training bout happens to be very high volume and you happen to be a very high level competitor, then you can justify intra workout nutrition. And if you were to strategically structure your intra workout nutrition, then you would cover the bases from protein to carbohydrate to electrolytes. And so that looks a little something like this. So, per the bits and pieces that we can find in the literature, about 10 to 20 grams per hour of protein or 5 to 10 grams of essential amino acids per hour will give you a potential edge in terms of anabolism, anti-catabolism, and it'll certainly raise amino acidemia during a potentially optimal time for an elevation in circulating amino acids to be maximal while you're training. And also, if you consume roughly 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour, you'll be covering all the bases for what you might need in terms of waning glycogen stores near the end of the training bout and being able to preserve maximal lifting capacity throughout a highly voluminous training bout. And then there's also another little bit of icing on the cake, maybe even sprinkles on the icing, would be sodium to the tune of about half a gram to a full gram per hour within the intra workout mix. The main electrolyte lost in sweat is sodium. And so once again, I want to reiterate, intra workout nutrition can be justified if a lifter does the session first thing in the morning without the opportunity to have a pre-exercise meal, or if the lifting happens to be extraordinarily voluminous to the point that training is carried out significantly longer than an hour straight and certainly headed towards 90 minutes. And with that, we can review or not. This slide is just emphasizing the importance of the advantage of not lifting in a fasted state. So this particular study done by Nash, Rudin, and colleagues found that the breakfast fed condition significantly outperformed the fasted condition on squat and bench press repetitions. And the breakfast was an interesting thing. It was a 600 calorie breakfast that was super high carb and pretty subpar in protein. But nevertheless, it served to illustrate the power of the pre-exercise meal in giving lifters an advantage. So one can build a case that people can become entrained or accustomed to not having a pre-exercise meal and still being able to make gains in muscular size and strength. But guess what? It's probably not going to be optimized. Okay, so let's pull everything together here. Rapid muscle gain is indeed mythical, and the best you can hope for if everything is right is about a quarter to a full pound of muscle gain per month in drug-free trainees. And the pound of muscle per month thing is very short-lived, and it only occurs at the beginning of people's training careers at best. So the ultimate muscular potential for drug-free men is about 20 to 45 pounds above and beyond the untrained state as an adult. Ultimate muscular potential for drug-free women is about 16 to 25 pounds above and beyond untrained women. And if you'll refer back to the other lessons, the time frames for these gains, we're looking at 5 to 10 years if you really focused and concentrated on your goal of reaching maximal muscular potential. Recomposition potential diminishes with increasing training status. So the different tactics for biasing your probability towards achieving recomposition, which is simultaneous gain in lean mass and loss in fat mass, is a pretty dang high protein intake, higher volume resistance training, and good sleep. Hypercaloric conditions maximize muscle growth because they accommodate escalating training volumes and they support maximal muscle protein synthesis and anabolic signaling. Muscle building macronutrient targets: protein at 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, carbs at least 3 grams per kilogram of body weight, and fat at a minimum of about a gram per kilogram of body weight. And the concept of the cake versus the icing is something important. So the cake is total daily nutrition. The icing on the cake is the specific timing of the constituent doses of the total, especially when we're talking about the goal of maximizing muscle growth. And I made a little note for myself to mention bulking and cutting cycles. So a few lessons back, we talked about acceptable amounts of fat to gain while you gain muscle. And this is in the context of bulking phases. It's funny how people sort of euphemize bulking nowadays. They call it gaining phases or building phases, when forever and ever we called it bulking. So I'm from the old school. I still call it bulking. What I have provided in the resource downloads are a couple of different bulking and cutting cycle models that you can use in practice. And I've observed great success from them in various field situations. And so make sure you have a look at those. And with that, we have concluded the module on muscle gain. Now go out there and help people make some gains in an evidence-based way.